Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of Out of My Life by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. We present this audiobook in 24 parts. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Chapter 6, The Campaign in Poland. 1. I leave the Eighth Army.
At the beginning of September, we had heard from the headquarters of the Austro-Hungarian army that their armies in the neighborhood of Lemberg were in serious peril, and that a halt had been called to the further advance of the Austro-Hungarian First and Fourth Armies. Since that time, we had followed events in that quarter with great anxiety and received further and worse reports. The following telegrams throw the best light on the sequence of events. From us to main headquarters on September 10, 1914. It seems to me questionable whether Rennenkampf can be decisively beaten, as the Russians have begun to retreat early this morning. As regards plans for the future, there is a question of concentrating an army in Silesia. Could we rely on further reinforcement from the west? We can dispense with 2 corps from this front. This was sent on September 10th, the very day on which Rennenkampf had begun that retirement to the east which had so much surprised us. Telegram from main headquarters to us on September 13. Release 2 corps as soon as possible and prepare them for transport to Krakow. Krakow? That sounded odd. We thought so, and said even more on the subject. In our perplexity, we wired as follows to main headquarters on September 13. Pursuit ended this morning. Victory appears complete. Offensive against the Narew in a decisive direction is possible in about 10 days. On the other hand, Austria, anxious about Romania, asks direct support by the concentration of the army at Krakow and in Upper Silesia. For that, 4 army corps and 1 cavalry division are available. Railway transport alone would take about 20 days. Further long marches to the Austrian left wing. Help would come too late there. Immediate decision required. In any case, the army must retain its independence there. This was on the day on which Rennenkampf was beginning to vanish into the marshes of the Niemen, with the loss of not merely a few feathers, but a whole wing, and grievously stricken as well. On September 14th, main headquarters replied to us as follows. In the present situation of the Austrians, an operation over the Narew is no longer considered hopeful. Direct support of the Austrians is required on political grounds. It is a question of operations from Silesia. The independence of the army will be retained even in case of joint operations with the Austrians. So that was it. There is a certain book, Vom Kriege, which never grows old. Its author is Clausewitz. He knew war and he knew men. We had to listen to him, and whenever we followed him, it was to victory. To do otherwise meant disaster. He gave a warning about the encroachment of politics on the conduct of military operations. In saying this, I am far from passing a judgment upon the orders we now received. I may have criticized in thought and word in 1914, but today I have completed my education in the rough school of reality, the conduct of operations in a coalition war. Experience tempers criticism, indeed frequently reveals how unfounded it has been. During the war, we have tunes without number attempted to think, "He is a lucky man who has an easier soldier's conscience than ours, and who has won the battle between his military convictions and the demands of politics as easily as we have." The political tune is a ghastly tune. I myself during the war seldom heard in that tune those harmonies which would have struck an echo in a soldier's heart. Let us hope that if ever our fatherland's dire necessity involves a summons to arms again, others will be more fortunate in this respect than we were. On September 15th, I had to part from General Ludendorff. He had been appointed Chief of Staff of the newly formed Ninth Army. On September 17, however, His Majesty gave orders that I was to take over the command of this army while retaining my control of the Eighth Army, which had been left behind to protect East Prussia, but was now reduced by the loss of the 11th, 17th, and 20th Corps, as well as the 1st Cavalry Division, which had been given up for the Ninth Army. The separation from my Chief of Staff was therefore truly a short one. I only mention it because legend has pounced upon it and exaggerated. In the early morning hours of September 18th, I left the headquarters of the First Army at Insterburg for a 2 days' journey by car across Poland, to the Silesian capital, Breslau. The first stage of my journey carried me over the battlefields of the last few weeks, conjuring up grateful memories of our troops. At the outset, we passed through deserted, burnt-out villages, and then gradually entered a region which had not been touched by war, where we passed peasants returning eastwards to find their deserted homesteads. Genuine peasantry, the best foundation of our national strength. I accompanied them in thought to the perhaps smoke-blackened remnants of their homes, a site from which they had been preserved for more than 100 years, thanks to our splendid army. Then we made for the Vistula through homely villages and small towns, where there seemed scarcely any traces of the splendor of historic Western culture. This was the ground Germany had colonized. Truly she had not given of her worst for it, though herself dismembered. Its greatest treasure is the capacity for work and high character of its inhabitants, a simple, loyal, reflective people. To me it seemed that here Kant's teaching of the categorical imperative had not only been preached, but was understood in the deepest sense and had been translated into the world of action. Almost all the German tribes have contributed to the work of culture in this region, a weary task that took centuries, and thus acquired those strong wills which have rendered priceless services to our fatherland in its hour of need. These and other serious thoughts of the same nature passed through my mind as we journeyed, and they never left me throughout the whole course of the desperate struggle. Germans, let me compress them into a warning. Gird yourselves, all of you, not only with the golden band of your moral duty to mankind, but with the steel band of an equal duty to your fatherland. Strengthen that band of steel until it becomes an iron wall in the shelter of which you will wish to live, and alone can live in the center of a European world in flames. Believe me, this conflagration will rage for a long time yet. No human voices will charm it away, no human compacts can keep it within bounds. Woe to us if the flames find even one broken fragment in that wall. It will become the battering ram of the European hordes against the last German fortress still standing. Our history has unfortunately told us so only too often. Once again I said farewell to the homeland with no light heart. But another farewell was even harder at this moment, the farewell to the independence we had previously enjoyed. However consoling the concluding sentence of the last telegram from main headquarters may have sounded, I suspected the fate which was in store for us. I knew it, not because of the previous campaign, for then we had enjoyed military independence, a treasure of gold in richest measure. I knew it from the history of earlier coalition wars.
2. The advance.
We had come to the conclusion that our best course was to concentrate our army in the region of Kreuznach in central Silesia. From there we thought we should have more room to maneuver against the northern flank of the Russian army group in Poland, the exact position of which had not been established at the moment. Impossible. If our army were allowed, we should like to advance with our right wing through Kielce, central Poland. Impossible. We should have liked strong Austro-Hungarian forces to have accompanied us north of the Vistula as far as the confluence of the San. Impossible. By the time all this had been pronounced impossible, it looked as if the whole operation might be, or become, impossible. We therefore concentrated our troops, 11th, 17th, 20th, Guard Reserve Corps, Warsch's Landwehr Corps, the 35th Reserve Division, and the 8th Cavalry Division, north of Krakow, in that closest touch with the left wing of the Austro-Hungarian army, which main headquarters had ordered. Our own headquarters were fixed for a time at Buithen, in Upper Silesia. The Austro-Hungarian command were sending from Krakow a weak army of only 4 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division north of the Vistula. They did not think they could spare anything more from the south side of the river, for they themselves were bent on a decisive attack in that quarter. This plan of our allies was certainly bold and did credit to its authors. The only question was whether there was any prospect that, in spite of all the reinforcement it had received, the greatly weakened army could carry it into execution. My doubts were tempered by the hope that as soon as the Russians had noticed the presence of German troops in Poland, they would throw their full weight against us and thereby facilitate the victory of our allies. The picture of the situation which we drew for ourselves when the movements began was somewhat vague. All we knew for certain was that the Russians had only been following the retiring Austro-Hungarian armies over the sand very slowly of late. Further, there were signs that north of the Vistula there were 6 or 7 Russian cavalry divisions and an unknown number of brigades of frontier guards. A Russian army seemed to be in process of formation at Ivangorod. Apparently, some of the troops of this army had been drawn from the armies which had previously faced us in East Prussia, while others had come fresh from Asiatic Russia. Further, we had received reports that a great entrenched position west of Warsaw and fronting west was in course of construction. We were therefore marching into a situation which was quite obscure and must be prepared for surprises. We entered Russian Poland and immediately realized the full meaning of what a French general, in his description of the Napoleonic campaign of 1806 in which he had taken part, called a special feature of military operations in this region: mud. And it really was mud in every form. Not only mud in the natural sense, but mud in the so-called human habitations and even on the inhabitants themselves. As soon as we crossed the frontier, it was as if we had entered another world. The question that rose involuntarily to one's lips was, how was it possible that in the very heart of Europe the frontier posts between Posen and Poland should form so sharp a line of demarcation between different degrees of culture of the same race? In what a state of physical, moral, and material squalor had Russian administration left this part of the country? To what a slight degree had the civilizing work of the over-refined upper social strata of Poland permeated the downtrodden lower strata? My very first impressions made me doubt whether the open political indifference of the masses could be given a higher impetus, through the influence of the clergy, for example, an impetus which might have led them voluntarily to range themselves on our side in this war. Our movements were rendered extraordinarily difficult by the state of the roads. The enemy obtained an inkling of what we were doing and took countermeasures. He withdrew 6 corps from his front against the Austrians, with the obvious intention of throwing them across the Vistula, south of Ivangorod, for a frontal attack upon us. On October 6th, we crossed the line Opatow-Radom and reached the Vistula. We here drove back such portions of the enemy's forces as were west of the river. At this point, it was apparent that our northern flank was threatened from the Warsaw-Ivangorod line. In these circumstances, it was impossible, for the time being, to continue our operation across the Vistula south of Ivangorod in an easterly direction. We must first deal with the enemy in the north. Everything else depended on the issue of the considerable actions which were to be expected in that quarter. A curious strategic situation was thus developing. While hostile corps from Galicia were making for Warsaw on the far side of the Vistula, our own corps were moving in the same northerly direction but on this side of the river. To hold up our movement to the left, the enemy threw large forces across the Vistula at and below Ivangorod. In a series of severe actions, these were thrown back on their crossing places, but we were not in a position to clear the western bank entirely of the enemy. 2 days' march south of Warsaw, our left wing came into touch with a superior enemy force and threw it back against the fortress. About 1 day's march from the enceinte, our attack came to a standstill. On the battlefield south of Warsaw, our most important capture was a Russian army order which fell into our hands and gave us a clear picture of the enemy's strength and intentions. From the confluence of the sand to Warsaw, it appeared that we had 4 Russian armies to cope with. That is about 60 divisions against 18 of ours. From Warsaw alone, 14 enemy divisions were being employed against 5 on our side. That meant 224 Russian battalions to 60 German. The enemy's superiority was increased by the fact that as a result of the previous fighting in East Prussia and France, as well as the long and exhausting marches of more than 200 miles over indescribable roads, our troops had been reduced to scarcely half establishment, and in some cases even to a quarter of their original strength. And these weakened units of ours were to meet fresh arrivals at full strength: the Siberian Corps, the elite of the Tsar's empire. The enemy's intention was to hold us fast along the Vistula, while a decisive attack from Warsaw was to spell our ruin. It was unquestionably a great plan of the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, indeed the greatest I had known, and in my view it remained his greatest until he was transferred to the Caucasus. In the autumn of 1897, after the Kaiser maneuvers, I had met the Grand Duke on the station of Hamburg and entered into a conversation with him which turned principally on the employment of artillery. But it was here in Poland that I had seen the Russian commander-in-chief for the first time actually at work, for he seems to have put in only an occasional appearance in East Prussia, and then merely as a spectator. If his plans succeeded, not only our Ninth Army would be in danger, but our whole Eastern Front, Silesia, and indeed the whole country would be faced with a catastrophe. Yet we must not yield to such black thoughts, but find ways and means to avert the menace. We accordingly decided, while maintaining our hold of the Vistula upstream from Ivangorod, to bring up from that quarter to our left wing all the troops we could possibly release and hurl them at the enemy south of Warsaw in the hope of defeating him before his fresh masses could put in an appearance. Necessity lends wings. We therefore asked Austria-Hungary to send everything she could spare in the way of troops in hot haste left of the Vistula against Warsaw. The Austrian High Command showed that they fully realized the situation, but at the same time raised doubts which were hardly in keeping with the emergency. Austria-Hungary, to whose help we had rushed, was quite prepared to support us, but only by the tedious method, which involved a loss of time, of taking over from the troops we had left on the line of the Vistula. This would certainly enable us to avoid the mingling of Austro-Hungarian and German units, but it put the whole operation in danger of miscarriage. Counter-proposals from our side led to no result, so we yielded to the wishes of Austria-Hungary in the matter.
3. The retreat.
What we had feared actually materialized. Fresh masses of troops poured forth from Warsaw and crossed the Vistula below it. Our far-flung battle line was firmly held in front, while superior enemy forces, reaching out farther and farther west, threatened to roll up our left flank. The situation could and should not be allowed to remain thus. Our whole joint plan of operations was in danger of not only floundering in the marshes, but of failing altogether. Indeed, it could be said that it had failed already, since the victory we hoped for in Galicia, south of the upper Vistula, had not materialized, although the enemy had brought great masses from there to meet the Ninth Army and had therefore weakened himself against our allies. In any case, we had to take the unwelcome decision, a decision which was received very unwillingly by the troops at first, to break away clear of the threatened envelopment and find a way out of our perils by other paths. In the night of October 18th to 19th, the battlefield of Warsaw was abandoned to the enemy. With a view to continuing the operation even now, we brought the troops fighting under Mackensen before Warsaw back to the Rawalowicz line, i.e. about 40 miles west of the fortress. We hoped that the enemy would hurl himself against this position, which faced east. With the troops, which had been relieved by the Austrians before Ivangorod in the south, we would then attempt a decisive blow at the main body of the Russian army group in the bend of the Vistula. A condition precedent to the execution of this plan was that Mackensen's troops should withstand the onslaught of the Russian hordes, and that the Austrian defense of the line of the Vistula should be so strong that the thrust we intended would be safe from any Russian flank movement from the east. In view of the strength of the Vistula line, this appeared an easy task for our allies. The Austrian High Command, however, made it much more difficult by their intention, good enough in itself, to attempt a great blow themselves. They decided to leave the crossings of the Vistula and north of Ivangorod open to the enemy with a view to falling upon the enemy columns as they were in the act of crossing. It was a bold scheme which had often been discussed and executed in war games and maneuvers in peace, and even in war carried out in brilliant fashion by Field Marshal Blücher and his Gneisenau at the Katzbach. But it is always a hazardous operation, particularly when the general is not absolutely sure of his troops. We therefore advised against it. But in vain, superior Russian forces pressed over the Vistula at Ivangorod. The Austrian counterattack gained no success and was soon paralyzed and finally converted into a retreat. Of what use was it now to us that the first Russian onslaughts on Mackensen's new front failed? The withdrawal of our allies had uncovered the right flank of our proposed attack. We had to abandon this operation. I considered that our best course was to continue our retreat and thus break away with a view to being able to employ our army for another blow elsewhere later on. It was in our headquarters at Radom that the idea took shape within me. At first only an outline, but yet clear enough to serve as a basis for further measures. My chief of staff will confirm this. His titanic energy would provide everything for their execution. Of that I was certain. I must admit that serious doubts mingled with my resolution. What would the homeland say when our retreat approached its frontiers? Was it remarkable that terror reigned in Silesia? Its inhabitants would think of how the Russians had laid waste East Prussia, of robbing and looting, the deportation of non-combatants, and other horrors. Fertile Silesia, with its highly developed coal mines and great industrial areas, both as vital to our military operations as daily bread itself. It is not an easy thing in war to stand with your hand on the map and say, I am going to evacuate this region. You must be an economist as well as a soldier. Ordinary human feelings also assert themselves. It is often these last which are the hardest to overcome. Our retreat in the general direction of Częstochow began on October 27th. The thorough destruction of all roads and railways was to hold back the solid Russian masses until we had got quite clear and found time to initiate fresh operations. The army pressed behind the Wiedoka and Warta with its left wing in the neighborhood of Sieradz. Headquarters went to Częstochow. At first the Russians were hot on our heels, but then the distance between us began to increase. This rapid change in the most anxious situation had to be the solution for the time being. At this point, I cannot help admitting how much the punctual knowledge of the dangers that threatened us was facilitated by the incomprehensible lack of caution, I might almost say naivete, with which the Russians used their wireless. By tapping the enemy wireless, we were often enabled not only to learn what the situation was, but also the intentions of the enemy. In spite of this exceptionally favorable circumstance, the situation that was developing made quite heavy enough demands on the nerves of the command, on account of the great numerical superiority of the enemy. However, I knew that we had our subordinate commanders firmly in hand, and had unshakable confidence that the men in the ranks would do everything that was humanly possible. It was this cooperation of all concerned that enabled us to overcome the most dangerous crisis. Yet, did it not look as if our final ruin had only been postponed for a time? The enemy certainly thought so and rejoiced. Apparently, he considered that we were completely beaten. This seems to have been his view of our plight, for on November 1st his wireless ran. Having followed the enemy up for more than 120 versts, it is time to hand over the pursuit to the cavalry. The infantry are tired and supply is difficult. We could therefore take breath and embark on fresh operations. On this November 1st, His Majesty the Emperor appointed me Commander-in-Chief of all the German forces in the East, and at the same time extended my sphere of command over the German eastern frontier provinces. General Ludendorff remained my Chief of Staff. The command of the Ninth Army was entrusted to General von Mackensen. We were thus relieved of direct command of the army, but our influence on the whole organization was all the more far-reaching. We selected Posen as our headquarters. Yet even before we took up residence there, we had at Częstochow on November 3rd come to the final decision as to our new operations, or rather I should say that our further intentions had received their final form.
4. Our counterattack.
The consideration that formed the basis of our new plan was this. In the existing situation, if we tried to deal purely frontally with the attack of the Russian Fourth Army, a battle against overwhelming Russian superiority would take the same course as that before Warsaw. It was not thus that Silesia would be saved from a hostile invasion. The problem of saving Silesia could only be solved by an offensive. Such an offensive against the front of a far superior enemy would simply be shattered to pieces. We had to find the way to his exposed, or merely slightly protected flank. The raising of my left hand explained what I meant at the first conference. If we felt for the enemy's northern wing in the region of Lodz, we must transfer to Thorn the forces to be employed in the attack. We accordingly planned our new concentration between that fortress and Gnesen. In so doing, we were putting a great distance between ourselves and the Austro-Hungarian left wing. Only comparatively weak German forces, including Worsch's exhausted Landwehr Corps, were to be left behind in the neighborhood of Częstochow. It was a condition precedent to our flanking movement by the left that the Austro-Hungarian High Command should relieve those of our forces moving north in the region of Częstochow by 4 infantry divisions from the Carpathian Front, which was not threatened at this time. For our new concentration in the region of Thorn and Gnesen, all the Allied forces in the east were distributed among 3 great groups. The first was formed by the Austro-Hungarian army on both sides of the upper Vistula, the 2 others of our 8th and 9th armies. We were not able to fill the gaps between the 3 groups with really good fighting troops. We had to put what were practically newly formed units into the 60-mile gap between the Austrians and our 9th Army. The offensive capacity of these troops was pretty low to start with, and yet we had to spread them out so much along the front of very superior Russian forces that to all intents and purposes they formed but a thin screen. From the point of view of numbers, the Russians had only to walk into Silesia to sweep away their resistance with ease and certainty. Between the 9th Army at Thorn and the 8th on the eastern frontier of East Prussia, we had practically nothing but frontier guards, reinforced by the garrisons of Thorn and Graudenz. Facing these troops was a strong Russian group of about 4 army corps north of Warsaw on the northern banks of the Vistula and the Narew. If this Russian group had been sent forward through Mlawa, the situation which had developed at the end of August before the Battle of Tannenberg would have been repeated. The line of retreat of the 8th Army therefore appeared to be once more seriously threatened. From the critical situation in Silesia and East Prussia, we were to be released by the offensive of the 9th Army in the direction of Lodz against the flank of the Russian main mass, which was only weakly protected. It is obvious that if the attack of this army did not get home quickly, the enemy masses would concentrate upon it from all sides. The danger of this was all the greater because we were not numerically strong enough, nor were our troops good enough in quality to pin down the Russian forces in the bend of the Vistula, as well as the enemy corps north of the middle Vistula, by strong holding attacks, or indeed mislead them for any considerable length of time. In spite of all this, we intended to make our troops attack everywhere, but it would have been a dangerous error to expect too much from this. Everything in the way of good storm troops had to be brought up to reinforce the 9th Army. It was to deliver the decisive blow. However great was the threat to the 8th Army, it had to give up 2 corps to the 9th. Under these circumstances, it was no longer possible to continue the defense of the recently freed province on the Russian side of the frontier. Our lines had to be withdrawn to the lake region and the Angarap. This was not an easy decision. As the result of the measures of which I have spoken, the total strength of the 9th Army was brought up to about 5.5 corps and 5 cavalry divisions. 2 of the latter had come from the Western Front. In spite of our earnest representations, main headquarters could not see their way to release further units from that side. At this moment, they were still hoping for a favorable issue to the Battle of Ypres. The full extent and meaning of the difficulties of a war on 2 fronts were revealing themselves once more. The lack of numbers on our side had again to be made good by speed and energy. I felt quite sure that in this respect the command and the troops would do everything that was humanly possible. By November 10, the 9th Army was ready. On the 11th, it was off with its left wing along the Vistula and its right north of the Warta. It was high time, for news had reached us that the enemy also intended to take the offensive. An enemy wireless betrayed to us that the armies of the Northwest Front, in other words, all the Russian armies from the Baltic to and including Poland, would start for a deep invasion of Germany on November 14th. We took the initiative out of the hands of the Russian commander-in-chief, and when he heard of our operation on the 13th, he did not dare to venture on his great blow against Silesia, but threw in all the troops he could lay hands on to meet our attack. For the time being, Silesia was thus saved, and the immediate purpose of our scheme was achieved. Would we be able to go one better and secure a great decision? The enemy's superiority was enormous at all points. Yet I hoped for great things. It would exceed the limits of this book if I were now to give a summary, however general, of the military events which are compressed into the designation Battle of Lodz. In its rapid changes from attack to defense, enveloping to being enveloped, breaking through to being broken through, this struggle reveals a most confusing picture on both sides. A picture which in its mounting ferocity exceeded all the battles that had previously been fought on the Eastern Front. In conjunction with the Austro-Hungarians, we succeeded in stemming the floods of half Asia. The battles of this Polish campaign, however, did not end with Lodz, but were continuously fed by both sides. More troops came to us from the west, but they were anything but fresh. Most of them were willing enough, but they were half exhausted. Some of them had come from an equally hard, perhaps harder struggle, the Battle of Ypres, than we had just fought. In spite of that, we tried with them to force back the Russian flood we had successfully dammed. And indeed, for a long time it looked as if we should succeed. But in the long run, as in the Battle of Lodz, it was seen that once more our forces were not sufficient for this contest, with the most overwhelming superiority which faced us in every battle. We should have been able to do more if our reinforcements had not come up in driblets. We should have been able to put them in simultaneously. But the colossal block we tried to roll back to the east only moved a short stretch, then lay still, and nothing would shift it. Our energies flagged. But it was not only in battle that they were dissipated, but also in the marshes. The approach of winter laid its paralyzing hand on the activity of friend and foe alike. The line which had already become rigid in battle was now covered with snow and ice. The question was, who would be the first to shake this line from its torpor in the coming months?
This concludes today's reading of Out of My Life, by Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at intonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.